Our speaker tonight is a real son of Notre Dame, but he's much more than that. Father John Raphael is a priest of the St. Joseph Society of the Sacred Heart, also popularly known as the Josephites. He's currently the principal of his high school alma mater, St. Augustine High School in New Orleans. After graduating from St. Augustine himself in 1985, he attended the University of Notre Dame and graduated with a BA in philosophy, managing to avoid all of my courses, I might say, in 1989. While at Notre Dame, Father Raphael was a member of the marching band and president of the Knights of the Immaculata. He didn't play football, but these were partly the Jerry Faust years, and hardly anybody played football in those years, I guess. He was an RA in Kavanaugh Hall, a great distinction at Notre Dame, under the rectorship of his great friend and priestly mentor, Father Matt Michelli, a genuine Notre Dame legend. During this time, and in the words of Father Raphael, as a fruit of Eucharistic and Marian devotion, he discerned a vocation to the priesthood. His discernment process was significantly influenced by another friend and spiritual director, and I might add another Notre Dame legend, Father Edward O'Connor, in the theology department. After graduating from Notre Dame, Father Raphael entered the Josephite Seminary and was ordained in 1995. In 2004, he was assigned to St. Augustine and returned to New Orleans just in time to catch Hurricane Katrina in the fall of 2005. We won't give him high marks for timing. I met Father Raphael really for the first time, although I'd heard about him forever, last spring. As some of you may know, we had a little unpleasantness on this campus around commencement, and 3,500 or so of us gathered on the South Quad to express our views about that. And among the people that Notre Dame students invited to speak to them was Father John Raphael. He was about 30 seconds into his speech when I turned to Elizabeth Kirk, who was sitting next to me on the platform, and said, an associate director of our center, and said, "I think we found our keynote speaker for the Common Good Conference." And she said, "I'll sign him up." So we did our best, and we landed Father Raphael. He's convinced, as am I, and as I think all sensible people are, that the historical experience of African Americans puts them in a unique position to be powerful public advocates for the rights of the unborn and all defenseless human beings. He's been perhaps the most significant leader in the pro-life movement within the African American community in this country in the last few years, and I think his most effective years are yet ahead of him. We have invited him tonight to talk about that topic and its relationship to the common good, and he has chosen to speak on the topic, building a bridge over troubled waters, inviting African Americans into the pro-life movement. Join me in welcoming Father John Raphael.
Good evening. I am both humbled and honored by this invitation to speak this evening and also, again, continue to marvel over the wonderful experience that we had back in May at the real graduation. And I'm happy to share with you a little bit what are simply insights, I think, from, I guess, about 20 years of my own experience in the pro-life and African American communities. In a few months, like some of you, and I understand we're going to have another fellow traveler in Father Jenkins, if what I read is correct, I'm going to make a journey to Washington, D.C. And it's a journey that I've made every year except one since 1991. Over the years, I have gone as a seminarian with other seminarians. As a parish priest, I've gone with parishioners. When I was a Newman chaplain, I attended with college students. And now, as a high school principal, I come with the young men from St. Augustine. The journey to which I refer is the Right to Life Mass and Rally held every year, January 21st and 22nd, to protest the Supreme Court decision of Roe versus Wade. Each year the trip is a special experience because, as I frequently share with the participants, with my fellow travelers, it is a pilgrimage, a journey of prayer and penance whose ultimate purpose is to invoke the power of God to remove the scourge of legalized abortion from our land, as we also exercise our constitutional right to freedom of speech in making our moral convictions known to our government officials. Last January, the trip was especially poignant because it literally came on the heels of one of the most historically symbolic events our nation has witnessed: the inauguration of Barack Obama, the first African-American president of the United States of America. Now, in the months that have passed since the inauguration, I have regularly reflected on and experienced the mix of emotions that surrounded that event, the pride, the euphoria that was so evident at the time due to this milestone, but also the angst that has been caused by the impact of this historic event on the unborn and on those who have dedicated themselves to protecting and defending innocent human life. My reflections come from the perspective of an African-American priest who has spent almost 20 years working, seemingly in vain at times, to bring African Americans into the pro-life movement, with a firm conviction that the black community, with its unique history in America and its traditional value system, has the potential to turn the pro-abortion tide and to help make America a truly pro-life country, as recent statistics show is indeed the trend among our citizens. However, the road to the particular destination which will bring about the wedding of the African American and pro-life communities is still a long and difficult one that has been made much more difficult in light of last year's presidential election. So achieving that goal will only come with perseverance, with prayer, with creative outreach, humility, and spiritual reparation. Why is that? To answer this question, I will attempt to express what my experience has caused me to see as the great divide, some might even say chasm, which exists between the pro-life and the African American communities. The division is not based exclusively on a fundamental disagreement about the immorality and tragedy of abortion. I say this based on the pro-life inclinations of hundreds of African Americans who have attended Respect Life conferences sponsored by my religious community. No, even for African Americans who are sympathetic to the pro-life message, this divide with the pro-life community exists at another level, a much deeper and far more complex level. To this day, there is a fundamental inability for these two groups to communicate effectively with each other due to an inability to understand different sets of fundamental assumptions. Thus, there exists lasting misunderstanding, frustration, and sadly mistrust. Now, one cause of the divide is to be found in the active pro-choice, pro-abortion advocates in the African American community. In spite of the staggering statistics regarding blacks and abortions in the United States, currently every member of the Congressional Black Caucus identifies him or herself as a supporter of Roe versus Wade and legalized abortion. Because of the peculiar mix of race and politics in America, in the political arena, respect for life concerns and legislation have by and large been cast as a one-party issue, and that party is the Republican Party. The result is that today there are no national-level African-American political voices raised in defense of the unborn among our elected officials. These same politicals who profess to fight for the interests of African-Americans in health care, educational and employment opportunities, voter representation, affirmative action, and all those other areas of civic life for which early civil rights pioneers fought so hard, these same people have abandoned the cause of justice for innocent and defenseless unborn African Americans. They have wholeheartedly embraced the Supreme Court decision Roe v. Wade as settled law, thus denying a whole class of persons the right to exist. The irony here is especially tragic, since these are often the first people to rightly criticize the Constitution of the United States for sanctioning slavery. And in a frequent misrepresentation of the 3/5 compromise, often attributing it to Southern racism as opposed to Northern checks on Southern congressional representation, they criticize the document for identifying this provision as another example of a fundamental moral flaw contained in it. So the irony of their embrace of Roe versus Wade, as if it issued forth from an infallible source, is striking because it was the same Supreme Court that consistently supported constitutional depersonalization and the consequent second-class status of people of African descent in its two infamous decisions of Dred Scott and Plessy versus Ferguson. This irony is apparently lost when the same group of people celebrates the famed decision mandating the dismantling of segregation with all deliberate speed in Brown versus the Board of Education, since this decision was a reversal of the court's prior support of less than equal protection under the law for persons of African descent in America. This wholesale abandonment by major black leaders of the newest unprotected class, the unborn, was painfully articulated in January 2003 when Reverend Al Sharpton, who was then seeking the Democratic nomination for the presidency of the United States, addressed the NARAL Pro-Choice America dinner in Washington, D.C. After proudly announcing that he had just crossed the picket line of pro-life protesters, using one of his catchier phrases, Sharpton proclaimed, "It is time for the Christian right to meet the right Christians." He then went on to defend his vigorous support of legalized abortion. Sharpton said, "I trust the decisions of women because it is a human right that Roe versus Wade decided on. This is not about abortion. This is about human rights. This is about human dignity. This is about women having their say-so over their own body and over how they will decide to proceed with their life. And if America is to be America, we must protect women's right to choose for themselves." Unquote. Now, it is extremely difficult to follow the twisted logic of that statement. After all, this debate, this crisis is about abortion and the human dignity of the unborn child. Yes, it is about the body of a woman, but it is also about the body of her child that will be dismembered and thrown away as if it were trash without even the benefit of a decent burial. What we learn from Sharpton's subsequent remarks is that for him, the legal sanction to destroy an unborn baby should now be treated as a civil right, just like the other authentic rights that Dr. King and others so valiantly fought for. Sharpton illustrates this point by linking the fight to establish Dr. King's birthday as a national holiday to the fight to preserve legalized abortion on demand today. Again, this is how Sharpton phrased it. But let's not forget, we didn't get Dr. King's birthday because someone donated it. We had to march. We had to petition. We had to fight. We had to lobby to get that birthday. And in the end, it was a great victory because even in the Deep South, where he was castigated, where he was denounced, yesterday, federal buildings were closed in honor of his day. We must have the same determination to keep fighting. Remember how we got Roe versus Wade in the first place. Some of us may have to roll up our sleeves, but it does not matter. We cannot let them roll back the clock. One would imagine Martin Luther King turning over in his grave, hearing these words. But note the particular use of the words we, us, and them. Sharpton has inseparably linked the African American community and its tradition of civil rights with the pro-abortion movement. Those who support the unborn person's right to live are designated by the term them. Sharpton's is a particularly perverted understanding of civil rights and justice. However, this speech is a classic example of the rhetoric employed by many national African American political and social leaders in support of a practice that is the cause of the greatest number of African American deaths in this country. In addition to voices such as Sharpton's, there is the equally troubling approach of some African American intellectuals who continue the long-standing tradition of support for and collaboration with Planned Parenthood. Despite at times being headed by Black Americans, the origins and foundational philosophy of Planned Parenthood are steeped in the worst kind of racism. Margaret Sanger's sympathy toward a number of racists and eugenicists is well known. But the candor of the openly pro-choice African-American commentator and now university president Julianne Malveaux, in her description of Margaret Sanger in a 2001 article, the candor is striking. Again, quoting Malveaux, "For all her positive influence, I see Sanger as a tarnished heroine whose embrace of the eugenics movement showed racial insensitivity at best. From her associates, as well as from some of the articles that were published in Sanger's magazine, The Birth Control Review, it is possible to conclude that racially insensitive is too mild a description. Indeed, some of her statements taken in or out of context are simply racist. And she never rebuked eugenicists who believed in improving the hereditary qualities of a race or breed by controlling mating in order to eliminate undesirable characteristics and promote desirable traits." Think about Trent Lott and his visit to Strom Thurmond's 100th birthday party. It is simply amazing that the commitment to abortion on demand has led those who are typically the most vocal denouncers of historical racism to give a pass to Margaret Sanger and to the organization that perpetuates her legacy. In spite of her repugnant views on race, Sanger remains, for Malveaux and for others sharing her commitment to legalized abortion, a heroine. One cannot avoid a certain sadness when examining the way in which some elitist members of the African American community, then and now, forged alliances with individuals and organizations that have wreaked havoc on the black community. The alliance continues today. The Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice, a coalition of predominantly African American, quote unquote, Christian organizations, churches, that are dedicated, among other things, as their website proclaims, to protecting a woman's right to choose. This organization has as affiliates groups calling themselves Clergy for Choice. It specifically targets African American youth in their annual Black Church Initiative Conference. Here they provide information about and access to contraceptives and abortion services with the blessing of their participating pastors. The legacy of Margaret Sanger continues to destroy the physical and moral fabric of the most vulnerable members of the African American community, sadly, with the assistance of some of our very talented minds. Lamenting this influence, an African-American Catholic bishop has made a poignant plea to the black community. Bishop Martin Hawley, the auxiliary bishop of Washington, D.C., recently wrote, "As an African-American, I am saddened by the evidence that black women continue to be targeted by the abortion industry. The loss of any child from abortion is a tragedy, but we must ask, why are minority children being aborted at such disproportionate rates? We must demand an end to the victimizing of African American children, women, families, and communities by Planned Parenthood and others in the abortion industry. Over 80% of Planned Parenthood clinics are located in minority neighborhoods. Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood, began the Negro Project to reduce the black population. We should be shocked and heartbroken, the bishop writes, by the findings of a recent investigation that recorded a fundraiser at an Iowa Planned Parenthood clinic saying she was very excited about a donation specifically for aborting black babies. These anti-life forces have had a profound influence on the way in which the African American community has responded to the abortion crisis, primarily by promoting the notion that the pro-life community is peopled by right-wing, racist conservatives who have no real concern for the African American community. This narrative is difficult to overcome even for many black Americans who personally recognize the fact that abortion is a moral evil. The partisan tone of recent political debates has further complicated this issue and muddied the debate. So the question we must ask, can the divide be overcome? Can a bridge be built between these two communities that will bring about an alliance for life capable of achieving substantive change in the law and in hearts and minds? I truly believe that it can, and have worked with many people of both races who are committed to accomplishing this task. I believe that this bridge must be built because African Americans need the pro-life community, and the pro-life community needs African Americans. African American and other minority communities are being targeted and decimated by anti-life forces, and our future is being destroyed by the genocidal magnitude of legalized abortion. In protecting and defending the unborn of every race, color, and creed, pro-lifers are saving the African American and other communities from eventual extinction. On the other hand, despite their voting patterns, the majority of African Americans I encounter in daily life do believe in the sanctity of human life and are not ideologically opposed to defending life. If the black community, with its unique American history, ever began to cast its political lot with the pro-life movement, a new force, a new power would be infused into the movement, and the change that we hope for, the change that we believe in, that is, an America that protects and defends life from conception to natural death, would have a much greater chance of becoming a reality. I believe that the key to building this bridge between the two groups lies in fostering an attempt to understand each other, to enter into the other's experience as deeply as possible, and to discover a basis for mutual respect and common ground. The election of Barack Obama has become a touchstone in reference to this problem, and I think using it as an example can help us to move forward. For what to one group is seen and experienced as the God-given answer to prayers of many generations, the very same thing is seen by the other group as apocalyptic disaster. President Obama represents two things simultaneously. For the overwhelming number of African Americans, he represents the answer, God's answer to the prayers of slaves and former slaves, children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren of slaves. To old and young African Americans, he has filled the cultural void that was left by the death of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. You allow me to personalize this for a moment. Again, as I said, I am the principal of my high school alma mater. This school, St. Augustine in New Orleans, has been dedicated to training African American boys to become faithful, productive, successful men since its inception in the segregated New Orleans of 1951. We were trained and taught that we could do anything that we wanted to do, that we were prepared and that we were competitive. So as a child and as a young boy, I was told that I could grow up, I could be president one day. And as a child, as a young man, I believed it. Just like I believed in Santa Claus, the Tooth Fairy, and all of those other things we tend to believe. As I grew older, however, and witnessed the presidential aspirations of men like Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton, I soon began to contemplate other options. But this time, it was different. Now, all of these young men under my charge had an articulate, intelligent, and very politically savvy young man who looked like them and who could possibly break the ultimate glass ceiling for an African American male. This was not just about politics anymore. This had become a major social, cultural, psychological phenomenon. But at the very same time, there was a problem, a huge problem. Because this very same man, throughout his brief political career, regarding public policy, had embraced one of the most aggressive pro-abortion agendas of any presidential candidate. So, for the pro-life community, understandably, his election represented perhaps the greatest setback that the movement had experienced in recent times and posed the greatest contemporary threat to legal protection for the unborn. Can there be a meeting of the minds between such diverse and seemingly contradictory positions? I think it can be done, but only by genuinely entering into the other's experience. Now, someone has to break the ice. I believe it ought to be the pro-lifers. We are to be the ones. And note, I can say we for both groups. But as pro-lifers, we are to be the ones who break the ice. Let me give you two examples of something that I frequently hear. When speaking to pro-lifers, they will often say, I just don't understand how blacks can continually vote for Democrats given their support for abortion. Don't they, that is the blacks, don't they understand what abortion is doing in their own community? Don't they see that they're being used by their own political leaders? Now, on the other hand, I hear from blacks, yeah, these pro-life people, they're against abortion, but they don't care anything about the poor, the death penalty, unemployment, the wars that we're fighting. And besides, Republicans, and we all know that pro-lifers are all Republicans, they don't care anything about blacks. Now, at the risk of oversimplification, I offer these two statements as a prism through which we might better understand the divide, the chasm. Let's look at the statement. Look at what the pro-lifers might say. Now, to be honest, these are legitimate questions at face value. They are questions that I frequently ask African Americans all the time. But coming from within the community, I am able to ask the question in a different way. Now, not necessarily a more effective way, but at least a much less offensive way. But what is offensive about it? You see, the problem with the question when asked by a white pro-life person is that it unintentionally fails to embrace an entire world of collective experience, customs, and values that have been forged out of a shared suffering, a world that is often quite foreign, if not alien, to the questioner. And the immediate thing that the African American here intuits is the omission, the failure to understand. Let me try to give a little example. A couple of months ago, local public television in New Orleans been running shows, a series of shows, New Orleans the way it was. These nostalgia shows. I'm sure South Bend probably has one. And for many folks, you know, these shows are moments, they're great opportunities for nostalgia and pining for the good old days. Down in New Orleans, there's a song we call it Ain't There No More. And it goes to all of the things that are no longer there. Huh? But, you know, does everyone experience those days in the same manner? Again, I was born in 1967. Today, actually. Yeah. As a child, I went to integrated public schools. My mother was a public school teacher. Then I chose to go to the Josephite-run St. Augustine High School. Now, I chose to go to St. Aug in the early 80s because I wanted to attend the best high school in New Orleans, not because it was the only option an African-American male had to get a Catholic secondary education in the city of New Orleans, as was the case when the school was founded. I had opportunities in New Orleans that my parents and certainly my grandparents never had. I remember them describing how different and difficult things were back in those good old days. And honestly, as a kid, I really did not appreciate those experiences. So now, as a man, I'm watching these programs. And I see some of the local celebrities who had remained in media long after integration. I knew them in their twilight, but I'm seeing them for the first time in their original environments. And I'm seeing, the interesting thing, I'm looking at the commercials because we can see reruns of the shows, but we rarely see the commercials. And one show was about the commercials. And all of a sudden I realized, my God, how white New Orleans was. At least on television. that our people, so integral to the fabric of that city and to the history of that city, were completely excluded, non-existent. One thinks of Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. What happened? I began to understand another interesting thing about New Orleans, why our most celebrated native son, Louis Armstrong, never wanted to return back to New Orleans after he reigned as King Zulu one year in Mardi Gras. Why? Because all around the world, the great Louis Armstrong, the ambassador of goodwill, welcomed and received by kings and queens, heads of state, as the ambassador of goodwill. But when he came to New Orleans to reign as King Zulu, he had to stay in a segregated hotel. Psychologically, these nostalgia shows began to hit me like a ton of bricks. Because though I didn't grow up in those times, I began to see in a far more tangible way the things that my parents and grandparents attempted to convey to me as a child. So coming from this background and attempting to tap into this experience, and the example I gave only barely scratches the surface, one begins to understand in a different way the overwhelming symbolism and experience of triumph, of vindication in the election of Barack Obama. This symbolism, this experience cannot be dismissed or ignored. And its legitimacy should not be rejected or denigrated. America took a huge step forward in moving beyond a painful past of racial inequity. And among many communities, not just the African American, a collective hallelujah was shouted as a result of this. So I think it is necessary that this progress be acknowledged, and in this context even celebrated. Now I know that makes some a little nervous, and it may even surprise some coming from me. But I believe that genuinely pro-life people can and perhaps should do this without in any way compromising their commitment, their absolute commitment to the protection and defense of life. This is a symbolic milestone, even a victory. And in acknowledging it, the pro-life movement is also affirming the value and the dignity of the African American experience. The pro-life movement is saying that we understand your struggle, we value your history, we have learned from our past. And if this message is heard by African Americans when they encounter pro-lifers, then a door will have been opened that makes possible a new and a different kind of conversation. This would enable the pro-life movement to speak to the black community first about its own fight for justice and equality, and then to invite members of that community to engage in a broader dialogue, which includes the undeniable racism that marks the strategies and policies of past and present pro-abortion advocates. There is much common ground left to be explored. But there is also another dimension to this conversation. As symbolic as the victory has been, as symbolic as the election has been, countries are not governed by symbols. They are governed by people, politicians to be exact. Our country is no exception. So having acknowledged the monumental symbolism of President Obama's election, which affects all races and ethnicities, not just blacks and whites, it is equally the responsibility of all citizens, especially citizens of faith, and yes, African American citizens of faith, to look at the specific positions of the person chosen to govern and to examine those positions in the light of faith and sound human reasoning. So if indeed the pro-life community is being asked to step out of itself and attempt to see the African American perspective on the election, then the African American community must also be asked to step out of itself and to see the pro-life perspective regarding the contemporary state of abortion in America. So this means that African Americans must not acknowledge, will have to acknowledge, the radically pro-abortion policies of President Obama. In spite of what appears for now to be a concession to pro-life Democrats in the health care bill recently passed in the House of Representatives, the record of President Obama regarding the unborn has been abysmal, and this record must be communicated to a constituency that has embraced the president with a fervor and devotion that transcends political allegiance. Absolutely essential to this phase of the bridge building is the educational effort that must be made. African Americans from all sectors of society must be made aware of the degree to which abortion affects the black community. Ignorance of the staggering statistics of abortion in the black community and of the postnatal care given to minority mothers and their children by pro-life institutions is the abortion lobby's greatest weapon. A culturally sensitive campaign to educate and enlighten has the potential to cause a revolutionary way of thinking about abortion in the black community. And it will also help African Americans get to know the pro-life community for what it truly is, a generous community that protects and nurtures the lives of babies and their mothers before and after birth. Not everyone will think that this is worth the effort. And based on some behavioral patterns up to now, there is not overwhelming public evidence to suggest that a significant change is likely. But my limited experience leads me to think otherwise. Looking back over 18 years of active pro-life work among African Americans, leading pilgrimages to the annual Mass and Rally, sponsoring regional pro-life conferences to bring the message to the people, speaking and teaching at schools and churches, I am beginning to see an awakening, especially among the young. They are beginning to get it. What they need is the motivation to express what they are getting privately. They need the motivation to express it in a meaningful public way. The education campaign will play a significant role in providing this motivation, because the motivation will come when the full scope and magnitude of abortion becomes a part of their everyday consciousness. I believe that the motivation will come when every African American understands that 447,000 black babies are aborted every year, 1,452 every day. I believe that the motivation will come when every African American understands that 13 million black babies have been aborted since 1973. I believe that the motivation will come when every black person understands that though we are 13% of the population, we account for 37% of the abortions. I believe that the motivation will come when every black American understands that Planned Parenthood for decades has had an agenda of reducing minority populations, hence their placement of clinics in predominantly black and Latino neighborhoods. Can any reasonable person of any race remain indifferent to these horrifying statistics? If these statistics are brought to them day after day, over and over again, yet statistics represent individual human lives. So given the particular history of blacks in this country, of being excluded, unprotected, constitutionally depersonalized and dehumanized, would African Americans continue to remain silent if they were vividly aware of the fact that close to 450,000 black boys and girls and 1.2 million little American boys and girls of every race, color, and creed are killed annually and legally? just as the images of Bull Connor's fire hoses and attack dogs awakened a nation in denial about the injustice of racial segregation, so also can a new campaign of information and education awaken a community in denial about the wanton destruction of its own future. Educators of minds and hearts will play a key role in building this bridge. They will be able to connect the issues that are near and dear to the African American community to the issues that are near and dear to the pro-life community. They will be the voices to remind the black community and all others that aborted babies don't vote. They can't get a good education. They have no access to decent housing. They cannot earn a just wage. They do not benefit from a clean and green environment. They cannot emigrate legally or illegally. And they have already received the death penalty and been executed by the state before they were even capable of committing a crime. It will be the function of these bridge-building educators to reinforce the notion that aborted babies cannot support or protest any policy, practice, or person whom they feel to be guilty of an infringement upon their rights. The only thing the aborted can do is die. And so these educators will remind those whom they teach that the only hope right now that the aborted have is the infinite mercy of our eternal Father. Now, thanks be to God, that is a blessed, a real hope. But His divine mercy does not remove our responsibility to make sure that each of them has their God-given right to live, protected by our government and our laws. Here, these two groups can find common ground. Both groups can come to an agreement. And I believe that many already agree that abortion is an evil that displeases God. As indeed previous generations eventually came to agree after a terrible war that slavery was an evil that displeased God. And later generations agreed after a courageous movement and many tragically lost lives that segregation was an evil that displeased God. Agreement can now be reached about abortion and the evil that it brings into our society. Furthermore, these two groups may even find that their coming together is mutually enriching. Being pro-life doesn't have to remain primarily a one-party political issue. Advocacy for the rights of the unborn can supersede all other political and social positions which are genuinely subjects of debate and disagreement, important as these issues may be. Success will be achieved when the pro-life movement is able to tap into the heart and soul of the African American community by convincing it that mutual respect and interdependency will shape the relationship so that mutually beneficial goals can be met. The church has a unique role to play as bridge builder in this endeavor. And as I suggested in May when I was last on the campus of Our Lady, that role is not to bestow awards and honors upon an executive who has steadfastly waged war against the unborn. No. Because of her clear and consistent teaching regarding the fundamental primacy of the right to life and defense of the unborn as a moral obligation of all people, and because of her extensive presence in and ministry to the African American community, the church is uniquely poised to facilitate this union. But in this politically and racially charged atmosphere in which we live, even the church has come under fire. Some have suggested that the bishops in the United States have been particularly harsh with President Obama. After all, he is not the first pro-choice politician or president. Some have even implied that there may have been racial bias in the bishop's approach. I heartily disagree with this. First, the church has been teaching and preaching and speaking out publicly about abortion since Roe v. Wade and before. Our current Holy Father, Pope Benedict XVI, and his predecessor, Pope John Paul II, have made the topic of abortion and the promotion of a culture of life central in their apostolic visits and messages to the people of the United States. This is nothing new for the church. But in his selection of quote-unquote pro-choice Catholics for key positions in his administration, the president has made these persons responsible for executing and administering these policies which are contrary to the natural law, contrary to the teaching of the church. The Catholic bishops of the United States have a moral responsibility and obligation to respond forcefully, and so does every Catholic and every person of goodwill. Why? Because the right to life is the fundamental, inalienable human right upon which all others rest. This point was made very clear in an intervention last year by an African-American Catholic bishop. In November of 2008, addressing then Senator Joseph Biden, Bishop John Ricard, my Josephite confrere of Pensacola, Tallahassee, wrote, "While grateful for the effective collaboration you and your office have offered on so many worthy projects and concerns, I also observe by your support for laws that fail to protect the unborn, a profound disconnection from your human and personal obligation to protect the weakest and most innocent among us, the child in the womb. The church's consistent ethic of life does not mean that abortion is simply one issue among a smorgasbord of other moral, ethical issues from which one may choose a pet project. The church's ethic of life embraces the continuum of life from conception to natural death. Hence, it recognizes that all other moral, ethical issues pertaining to justice and equity all presuppose the fundamental right to live, to exist, to be. They are all related to the fundamental right to life. As in a tree, the leaves are to the branches to the trunk to the root. The right to life is the root. Addressing the Catholic bishops of the United States, Cardinal George of Chicago and President of USCCB set an important tone for Catholic engagement with the current presidential administration. And this same tone will help us in building the bridge. His Eminence acknowledged the symbolic importance and the triumph of this historic election. But he also reminded us that as Catholics, we must actively fight to defend the most defenseless among us. Acknowledging the moment in history, His Eminence wrote, "The bishops of the Catholic Church in the United States welcome this moment of historic transition and look forward to working with President-elect Obama and the members of the new Congress for the common good of all." Because of the Church's history and the scope of her ministries in this country, we want to continue our work for economic justice and opportunity for all. Our efforts to reform laws around immigration and the situation of the undocumented. Our provision of better education and adequate health care for all. The Church is intent on doing good and will continue to cooperate gladly with the government and all others working for these goods. But acknowledging the other dimension and the unique moral and political challenges of our times, His Eminence further said, the fundamental good is life itself, a gift from God and our parents. A good state protects the lives of all. Legal protection for those members of the human family waiting to be born in this country was removed when the Supreme Court decided Roe v. Wade. This was bad law. The dangers the bishops see at this moment is that a bad court decision will be enshrined in bad legislation that is more radical than the 1973 Supreme Court decision itself. His Eminence was referring to the Freedom of Choice Act. He went on to say that this would be an evil law that would further divide our country, and the Church must be intent on opposing evil. Because protecting life is a fundamental responsibility of every human being, and because protecting life also means nurturing and sustaining the lives of all after conception and birth, building a culture of life means that our responsibility does not end at birth, but it must include the defense of life from its very origin. This comprehensive approach to protecting the dignity and rights of every human being, coupled with a genuine willingness to listen to the concerns of all who are skeptical regarding the motives and ends of the Right to Life movement, it will bear fruit. It will help all people to recognize that where the unborn are now, we all once were. I truly believe that we can all come together in mutual respect, even while other differences remain, to change the way our country thinks on this issue. Dr. King appealed to the goodness that he believed lay in the hearts of each human person, made in the image and likeness of God. He believed that even his staunchest opponent and his most violent enemy was capable of change, and that same spirit is needed today. It is needed for these two communities to come together to work for a common goal. It is needed for our president and the Congress to see the truth of legalized abortion for the heinous crime against humanity that it is, and to reject it wholeheartedly. It is needed to understand that campaign rhetoric and governance are often radically different. Thus, there is hope that with hard work, commitment, and sacrifice, not empty platitudes and pious wishes, disparate groups with disparate backgrounds and perspectives on many other important issues can come together as one in churches, in schools, in legislative assemblies, at abortion clinics, in conferences, and wherever else pro-life people of every stripe gather to make these United States a land of life and opportunity for all. In the Beatitudes, our Lord tells us, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for justice. They shall be satisfied. Blessed are the peacemakers. They will be called the children of God. Blessed are those persecuted for the sake of righteousness. Theirs is the kingdom of heaven. In each of those three Beatitudes, there is a common theme. They are blessed who are willing to sacrifice their own good for the good of another. Those who thirst for justice, who thirst for the other's good and places that good before his or her own. The peacemakers, those who are not simply content to stand on the side and to be peaceful, but those who are willing to offer themselves as sacrificial victims in imitation of our Lord to bring peace to those who are at war. And blessed are the persecuted, those who are willing to suffer, and to suffer joyfully, so that others might thrive, might live, and might grow. This is the charge and the spirit in which we are to approach this great issue. There was great and powerful symbolism in the last election. But there is an even greater need to make that symbolism meaningful, a reality, a triumph for all. May Mary, the mother of life, intercede for our cause and unite these two groups together. And may the Lord Jesus Christ, the mediator between God and men, the divine bridge builder, unite us together in the protection and in the defense of life. Thank you.
I think you will all agree. We have time for some questions before we go outside. You'll notice there are microphones at the end of the aisle here and upstairs. You just walk to a mic and put your mouth close to it. It works. Okay, good. Thank you.
Father, thank you so much for that. Professor Solomon in his introduction, and you at some point touched on moral traditions that have built up in the African and American community. A recent manifestation of this, I think that a number of us saw, was the Proposition 8 campaign in California, and then some of the hubbub surrounding the city council in D.C.,
Sure.
Especially as it pertains to leaders of African American churches, very prominent in their community, large churches. I was wondering if a similar, I don't know if you could say a similar tide is building up with the life issues that has built up with the marriage issues, or whether it could, or whether it already has, and some of us just don't know about it. But these seem like men and women who have, whose legwork has been manifest recently, and whose legwork could be manifest on many of the things you just mentioned.
Okay, and I think that's a very interesting topic to bring about a comparison, because I think there are a couple of serious parallels between the two issues, and there is one significant difference. In one sense, the Proposition 8 response in California represents the kind of revolution in not only in thinking but in action that I think can take place. Here is an example where, because of a sort of a visceral response to a particular moral issue, what you have is a complete casting aside of the prevailing political orthodoxy, that something much deeper was touched, and there was a response. In that vein, I believe this can be replicated with the right to life issue. However, what we have to do to get there is to raise the consciousness. One of the things I like to say is, there's good anger and there's bad anger. And if we could get the good anger in the African American community directed toward the right enemies, the enemies of innocent life, of unborn African American life, I do believe that a similar kind of overthrow, so to speak, of political orthodoxy, which doesn't require something I don't think will ever happen, a wholesale move to the other political party, but what you will have is a veto, so to speak. If you can bring about that same passionate awareness that there is something wrong here. So in that sense, I do think the two issues are parallel, and one can serve as a model for the other. On the other, where they're a little different, is the proposition is impersonal in that it is not connected to an individual toward whom and concerning whom people have a personal devotion and commitment. So when there is a personality cult, however you want to phrase that, that makes it a little more difficult. So, for instance, in a post-Obama United States, whether it be 4 years or 8 years, you might be able to revisit the topic in the life issue in a different way without having the sort of personal allegiance that many folks have now. Either you're for him or you're against him, and because he has so many enemies out there, you just got to circle the wagons and protect him. So I do think there's a little bit of a difference in reference to this issue because it's connected to a person, but there is a real ability to tap into that kind of passionate conviction, settled conviction that says, this is terrible. We're not doing this anymore. We don't care who asks us to do so.
Would you identify yourself? Yes, my name is Bernard Franceschi. I'm from Portland, Oregon. I remember reading in somewhere around June of 1973, there's an interview with Reverend Jesse Jackson in a paper called The National Observer. And so this was a few months after Roe v. Wade. And at that time, you could say that Reverend Jackson, in the best sense of the word, was arguably more radical in that he was definitely pro-life and even characterized this as the most fundamental civil rights issue, and even characterized abortion as a form of genocide. I was wondering, number one, was that attitude typical within the civil rights leaders, such as Jesse Jackson? And secondly, what happened?
And, you know, it's interesting. In preparing this address tonight, I had to make a decision. Do I go with the Sharpton quotes or do I go with the Jackson quotes? Because they both come in a different way. But you're correct. One of the most eloquent, that 1973 article that Jackson wrote is one of the most eloquent pleas that invokes his personal experience. His mother was unwed. She had been counseled to abort him. She made a decision not to abort him. That position would have, among the general populace, and certainly, and if you've listened to people like Dr. Alveda King, the niece of Dr. King, would certainly affirm that at the time, certainly at the time of his death, Dr. King would have been pro-life. Interestingly, many people don't know more radical groups such as the Black Panthers were traditionally very pro-life, even post Roe v. Wade, because they saw this as an elitist, progressive, white agenda. I mean, they understood the Sanger connection. When did it change? In my research of this, Jesse Jackson went from this rather extensive and profound defense of life to a very brief statement affirming the right of a woman to choose in the time between his first and second attempt to get the Democratic nomination. In the first time, he still fell on the pro-life side. Something happened in between those two times. I've not found any extensive defense of the switch, only a mere statement. So he's gone from that extensive apologia in behalf of life to just a declaration he believes in a woman's right to choose. And it took place between those two nomination attempts.
Thanks, Bishop. My question is, how do we get to the bridge that you were talking about in your speech? How do we get people from the pro-life movement to come down to where we are to deal with the information that we need to have to empower Afro-Americans? And once they're empowered, then they can make better choices. Again, a lot of information never gets down to our community to deal with the needs of the poor and the disconnected. My question to you is, how can we go about doing that?
I think it takes, and it is a very good question, and it's something that I've dealt with a lot. It takes, at least to start it off, individuals who, through their own circumstances, are able to have a foot in both communities. I mean, part of the work that I've done over the years, I, for want of a better term, this is the white version of the talking, and I have a black version of the talk. Depending on the kind, because it takes individuals who, because there are many pro-life people, white pro-life people who are just dying to get into the black community, and they meet with such hostility, such resistance, and they really don't understand. So it's a very frustrating experience. So in many instances, those of us who, because of our own ethnic backgrounds, who are able to, individuals who can connect communities, we have a role to play in that and to help folks. I mean, that's one of the reasons with an address like this, to sort of help folks who had these experiences of attempting with good faith, goodwill, and being treated as if, they had come, with the full sheet and gown on because they're attempting to speak about this issue. So it begins with individuals and pro-life folks who are willing, who want to reach out and who are willing to allow folks like me, like you, and others who are involved to sort of help them navigate. I mean, you need a navigator because, as I said, it's foreign territory, and it's no one's fault. It's no one's fault, but it can be difficult. We experience the hostility, but it's okay. I'm related to you. I know. But for others, it becomes more difficult. So that's one of the positive things that I see, that there are more individuals who are coming out, and pro-life groups who are really, really reaching out to find folks in different communities who can serve as navigators, as guides to help bridge that group. So that's my answer to that.
Gail Biederman, University of Notre Dame. I guess I'm wondering about, I know people in the African American community who are pro-life, but when they think of the pro-life movement, they don't think of the Catholic pro-life movement particularly. They often think of the part of the pro-life movement that is anti-tax, anti-welfare state, does not want to address the issues that lead to poverty and despair and perhaps encourage abortion. You can disagree with me on that. Can you speak to what the responsibilities of the pro-life movement might be to address those kinds of issues?
Again, and it's one of the things, and individuals and groups have to sort of discern, how do we sort of sift out? It doesn't mean to abandon. I mean, there are many issues. Economic policy, national defense, etc., where people are free to have differences in approach, differences in means to achieve a goal. I do believe on all sides that there needs to be ability to prioritize and to establish a hierarchy of goods, so that, for instance, from the pro-life side, and when I use the phrase, I think the pro-life community needs to break the ice, it doesn't mean that I'm not asking a person to abandon a legitimate position that's not necessarily an absolute moral position, but what I'm asking is, can we make the distinctions that we need to make, and can we bring to the forefront, agreeing to disagree perhaps on some of the other negotiable or arguable issues, can we bring to the forefront the non-gainsayable, the moral absolute issues? You know, it's interesting. I deal with a lot of African American pro-life people their greatest source of strength and information and courage is the teaching of the Catholic Church. Now, they rarely encounter, certainly black Catholics, in the movement, but a group I'm thinking about, LEARN, the Life Education Resource Network, which is probably the most extensive black pro-life network, profound respect for the Catholic teaching on life, and they use it a lot, but they don't encounter African American Catholics. So again, I think it's a matter of establishing a hierarchy, and that's the equal responsibility of all. Let's put the life issues to the forefront, and let's agree as best we can to civilly disagree on some of the other issues. I don't think folks have to be coerced into abandoning their positions that they legitimately have argued themselves to.
Mel Party, University of Notre Dame. Father John, I think you touched on some of these in your presentation already, but I'm thinking about a lot of the African Americans that I know who, when they see the pro-life movement, when they hear life issue, pro-life, the abortion issue is the only issue that they hear. But in their day-to-day existence, there are a lot of other life issues, and the consistency of life the Pope speaks of, those issues are all related. But it seems to be that what we hear in the media a lot is that there's one issue that is so much more important than all the others, and what is heard is that means those other issues are not important. And I think part of it grows out of the separation of the issues by the politicians, so that you can have the Democrats who are fighting against the death penalty, and the Republicans are fighting against abortion, but not seeing that these issues are in every way related, or in quality of life, or whatever it may be. So I'm wondering if it would be even possible or feasible if the approach would be to make sure that as one is talking about, when they speak of life issues, as they're talking about abortion, they are also talking about death penalty. They're also talking about quality of life issues, inseparable, in a way that the church can approach it inseparably, but politicians cannot, or at least it's been very difficult for them to do that.
I'm going to have a little personal aside. Mel and I went to Notre Dame together. When we first met, I was skinny and he had hair. Again, I think that's a very profound question, and my answer to the question is this. On one end, I think, and I tried to address it, we have to look at, again, the hierarchy of goods. There's that old maxim, in one sense, when the house is on fire, what color you're going to paint the kitchen is not really the priority at that time. One of the things we have to look at is the magnitude and scope of the issue. I often ask questions, does anyone know when the death penalty was reinstituted in the United States? 1976. Does anyone know the number of executions that have taken place, roughly, since 1976? And it's about 1,000, okay? Now, every human life is of infinite and irreplaceable value. But when we look at scope and magnitude, when we compare since 1973, 50 million human beings, innocent human beings, without any possibility, scope and magnitude has to be factored into that hierarchy and into that equation. Another interesting aside I often ask folks, in reference to the executions, how many have been African American? And a lot of people think that it's the majority, 50% plus. It's not. It's roughly been about 300 out of the 1,000. Another interesting parallel is that abortions, 37% African American. The executions, roughly around 33% African American. Does it mean that that issue is unimportant? No, it doesn't. One has to also factor in, and this is something that's often lost in debate, the church's clear teaching regarding the death penalty and the application of death penalty and regarding abortion. As you know, the church does not have an absolute moral prohibition against the death penalty. Now, that's not an advocacy. Mine is not a position of advocacy, but it is a critical distinction that needs to be made. It means that theoretically, every instance of it is subject to a legitimate examination to see whether or not it meets the moral criteria that the church's teaching is very clear about. So we're not dealing with a moral absolute in that sense. Abortion is a moral absolute. Always and everywhere it is forbidden. So you're right, politicians tend to frame this as if they're parallel issues, it's a ping pong game. You say tomato, I say tomato, etc. But I think when we do the deeper reflection, we recognize, one, on the scope and magnitude level, that the house is on fire, is being consumed on the abortion side. And as Mother Teresa, I think, so beautifully put it, that looking at some of the systemic causes of the widespread violence that we find in our society, much of which results in the crimes that are tragically punished with capital punishment, that mentality of violence and hatred stems from the fundamental disrespect for life in the womb. So I think that our approach to the issue cannot be framed by the political debate, that we have to recast the issue according to the fundamental realities here, and for me at least, that helps me to again navigate through this very imperfect political order in which we must function, but to do it in a way that I believe is going to be most consistent and have extend the protection of law to the innocent in the greatest possible way. So again, that would be my response there.
I'm Christopher Mengelhardt from Rice University, and I'm sorry I got in late. I was driving in from Chicago, and I want to thank you so much for your presentation. My first is just an observation, and then maybe a question out of left field, because I came back on Monday from spending 2 weeks in China. And it's hard for the Chinese to even get the idea of the ethics of life, or the right to life. The first is, I'm an Orthodox Christian, and I truly do oppose abortion even without worrying about whether the fetus is ensouled. We do it because that's why Christians, in a sense, obey one of the 7 laws of Noah. You don't bring blood from an embryo. On the other hand, for 2,000 years, we've supported capital punishment. So when we have us as colleagues, we'll be able to very zealously oppose abortion, and on capital punishment, we'll say, well, gee, our bishops have reaffirmed this is what we've done for 2,000 years. We don't change. So when you get people working together, you'll have people with truly different perspectives. But the last one, I wonder if there's any way of understanding the ethics of life or life issues without a religious life. China's been so secularized, it's hard for them to see. Their hearts to be open to the issue. And the reason why America can open the issue is not so much moral arguments, but that more Americans live a Christocentric life. Can one ever get these ethical issues right without a Christocentric life? I doubt it.
Okay. All right, and again, I appreciate it. I do think, give an example. We always have the great debate. When I was in the seminary, my rector who's very pro-life, used to always say to us when we would go to the rally and the mass, you ought not to wear your collars. You ought to go, because this is not a religious issue, it's a moral issue, it's a moral issue. Now, this was a very traditional priest, but this was his way of making the point. Now, we all wore our collars. It wasn't a command. But, I think part of our Catholic tradition is that we can have that, theoretically, we can have that conversation without invoking our divine revelation, without invoking the catechism. We can have a moral and ethical discussion. Now, of course, our faith in grace is certainly going to dispose us more to receiving it. And make us more susceptible and more receptive of it. But nonetheless, I don't think we should ever rule out the possibility of having a philosophical debate about these issues just based on principles of equity. It's a substitution principle. If you were the fetus, what would you want? Where does your right as an individual, you who are about to make this decision, there's no invocation of religion there. If the tables were turned and you were the fetus, do the rights you have now as a viable human being, full-grown human being, do they derive from something external or were they inherent to you? It's just one kind of argument. There are a number of other arguments that can be made, but I do think it's important for us not to have a fideistic approach that excludes philosophical and ethical considerations that we can have with any rational and well-intentioned human being.
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, I'm the first person to be very and much in favor of any law that restricts access to abortion, restricts the number. But until such a law is passed, how do we, as members of the pro-life movement, reach out to women in general, but specifically minorities, so that fewer individual women make the decision to kill their children?
I think one of the the hidden secrets of the pro-life movement is that not enough people are aware of the hundreds, if not thousands, of pregnancy health centers all over the country that are reaching out primarily to minority women. We can, one, by making sure that those institutions which exist are strong and vibrant, and by multiplying those institutions, because at that level, we're no longer dealing with a philosophical or theological debate. We're dealing with meeting basic human needs. And the very same people who are praying at the clinics are the same people who are staffing the pregnancy health centers, the pro-life health centers. So that cannot, the importance of that, the significance of that aspect of the movement cannot be overlooked, and it cannot be underestimated. So the larger community, whatever their resources may be, publicizing the ones that are there, supporting the ones that are there, and increasing and giving people a place to go, giving them a real viable alternative. It's already taken place, but it is one of the, in a bad sense, the best kept secrets about the pro-life movement.
Before we adjourn outside, I'm going to ask, we're so grateful Father Raphael left his friends in school to come up here on his birthday. I'd like Andrew Remick to stand up and lead us in singing Happy Birthday.